The day I stepped into the courthouse, my hands were trembling. Not because I feared losing, but because I already knew how this story usually ended for people like me. I was Amelia, the quiet daughter, the overlooked one, the sister who never asked for more than fairness. Across the aisle sat my older sister, Victoria, polished in designer black, confidence wrapped around her like armor. She had money, influence, and lawyers who spoke as if the verdict already belonged to her. All I had was my late father's memory, a sealed envelope I barely understood, and a truth that had been ignored for years. The judge called the case to order. Victoria smirked, and I braced myself until the courtroom doors opened and a man in a black suit walked in, carrying a briefcase that would change everything. When my father, Richard Hale, died, the house felt strangely hollow, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for years and finally let it go. Grief didn't arrive loudly for me. It settled in slow, heavy layers, in the quiet spaces where his voice used to be, in the chair by the window where he drank his tea every evening, in the way the world kept moving while mine stood still. I was Amelia, his younger daughter, the one who had stayed when staying wasn't convenient, the one who knew his silences as well as his smiles. My sister Victoria arrived for the funeral dressed in black silk and controlled sorrow, surrounded by whispers and polite nods, already moving through the rooms like an owner returning to inspect what was hers. Even before the will was mentioned, I could feel the shift, the invisible line being drawn between us, sharp and unforgiving, carved by money, resentment, and years of unspoken rivalry that had never truly healed. Victoria and I grew up under the same roof, but lived in entirely different worlds. She left early, chasing ambition, wealth, and recognition, always certain she deserved more than what she had. I stayed, not because I lacked dreams, but because my father needed someone who listened, someone who noticed the tremor in his hands when he signed documents, the exhaustion behind his jokes, the way he lingered on memories when the nights grew long. While Victoria built an empire of influence and luxury, I learned the rhythms of caregiving, of patience, of presence. I managed doctor appointments, balanced household bills, and sat beside him during sleepless nights when he spoke about regrets he never shared with anyone else. He never complained about Victoria, but there was a sadness in his eyes when her name came up. A quiet disappointment that love had turned conditional for her, measured in returns and status rather than care. The inheritance became the spark that ignited everything we had avoided confronting. It wasn't just about property or money, it was about recognition, validation, and whose version of love mattered more. Victoria believed inheritance followed success, that her wealth and social standing made her the obvious heir, the logical choice to control everything our father had left behind. To her, I was an afterthought, a dependent shadow who happened to be present when it was convenient. She spoke of fairness in numbers, percentages, and assets, never acknowledging the years I gave without expecting anything in return. When the lawyer first mentioned the will, Victoria's confidence was absolute, her smile thin and knowing, as if the outcome had already been decided in her favor long before our father took his last breath. What she didn't understand was that my father saw things differently. He believed inheritance was not a reward for success, but a reflection of trust. In quiet conversations late at night, he spoke about responsibility, about how wealth without empathy hollowed people out, about how power revealed character rather than creating it. He never promised me anything, never hinted at figures or properties, but he asked questions that lingered about whether I felt secure, whether I knew my worth, whether I would stand firm if challenged. At the time, I thought he was simply reflecting on life as it slipped away from him, but those questions took on a different weight after he was gone, echoing in my mind as Victoria's lawyers began circling like predators scenting weakness. The division between us hardened quickly. Conversations turned formal, then hostile, then disappeared altogether. Victoria no longer spoke to me as a sister, but as an obstacle. Someone standing between her and what she believed was rightfully hers. The house that once held shared memories became a contested space. Every photograph, every piece of furniture transformed into evidence rather than history. I felt grief twisting into something sharper, a realization that loss had not only taken my father, but had stripped away the last illusion of family unity. And as the legal papers arrived and the court date loomed closer, I understood that this inheritance was never meant to unite us, only to reveal the truth we had both been avoiding for years. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not just in temperature, but in atmosphere, as if warmth itself had been filtered out to make room for procedure and judgment. When I walked in that morning, my footsteps sounded too loud against the polished floor, every echo reminding me that I did not belong to this world of sharp suits and sharper words. Victoria was already there, seated confidently at the front with her legal team arranged neatly beside her like an extension of her authority. She looked composed, almost bored, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested this was merely another business meeting for her, one she fully intended to win. I could feel her certainty from across the room, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me before a single word had been spoken. Victoria's strategy became clear the moment her lead attorney stood to speak. He didn't attack me directly at first. Instead, he built a narrative, one carefully designed to sound reasonable, even compassionate. He described Victoria as a successful entrepreneur, financially literate, experienced in managing complex assets, someone who understood the responsibility that came with wealth. Then, almost gently, he contrasted her with me, portraying me as fragile, emotionally dependent, and unequipped to handle such a significant inheritance. Every sentence was delivered with practiced calm, the kind that made cruelty sound like concern. According to them, I wasn't being excluded out of malice, but protected from a burden I supposedly could not carry. As the arguments unfolded, it became painfully clear that this was never just about legal entitlement, but about control and perception. Victoria's team questioned my choices, my lifestyle, and even my relationship with my father, implying that my closeness to him was less about love and more about influence. They spoke of undue persuasion, of a daughter who remained behind, not out of devotion but convenience, suggesting that my presence had somehow compromised my father's judgment. Each claim landed like a quiet blow, subtle enough to avoid sounding overtly vicious, yet sharp enough to leave invisible bruises. I watched the judge's face carefully, searching for signs of skepticism, but all I saw was neutrality, a blank canvas onto which Victoria's lawyers continued to paint their version of the truth. Victoria herself took the stand with an ease that stunned me. She spoke confidently about her achievements, her financial success, her understanding of investments and property management, weaving her resume into a justification for why she should control everything. When she spoke about our father, her voice softened just enough to appear sincere, though her words felt rehearsed, curated for maximum impact. She talked about providing him with financial security from afar, about honoring his legacy by ensuring his assets were managed properly. Not once did she mention the nights he spent alone, the illnesses she never saw, or the quiet moments when he reached for reassurance rather than reassurance of wealth. When it was my turn, the contrast was impossible to ignore. I had no team of attorneys surrounding me, no carefully crafted image to project. My voice wavered as I spoke, not because I lacked truth, but because truth doesn't always arrive polished. I spoke about caring for my father, about shared routines and unspoken understanding, about love that didn't announce itself with grand gestures. Yet I could sense how easily such things could be dismissed in a room that valued documentation over devotion. Victoria's lawyers seized on every pause, every emotional crack, framing them as proof of instability rather than humanity. Throughout it all, Victoria never looked at me. She stared straight ahead, composed and distant, as if acknowledging me might weaken her position. Her power play wasn't loud or dramatic. It was strategic, designed to overwhelm through confidence, resources, and social authority. By the time the judge called for a recess, I felt reduced to a case file, my relationship with my father flattened into bullet points and accusations. Walking out of that courtroom, I understood that Victoria wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. She was fighting to erase me from the narrative entirely, to rewrite our shared history in a way that left no room for the quiet daughter who stayed when staying meant everything. My father had always been a man of few words, the kind who believed that what mattered most didn't need to be announced. Growing up, I learned to read him in glances and pauses, in the way his shoulders sagged at the end of the day, or how his fingers lingered on old photographs when he thought no one was watching. After his death, those silences grew louder, filling my thoughts as I tried to understand what he had chosen to say, and more importantly, what he had chosen to withhold. Sitting alone in the house we once shared, I began to realize that his quiet nature had not been a lack of feeling, but a deliberate restraint, a way of protecting truths he knew would cause pain if spoken too soon. In the years leading up to his illness, my father watched Victoria from a distance, proud of her success, yet uneasy about the cost at which it came. He never criticized her openly, never questioned her ambition aloud, but there was a shift in his tone whenever her name surfaced in conversation. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a tightening around the eyes, a pause before responding, as if he were carefully choosing words that would not ignite conflict. He told me once that love didn't always look the way people expected it to, that sometimes it meant stepping back rather than intervening, allowing people to reveal themselves through their choices. At the time, I didn't understand that he was speaking less about philosophy and more about his own heartbreak as a father watching his child drift further away. As his health declined, those unspoken tensions deepened. Hospital rooms became places of confession without witnesses, spaces where he allowed fragments of truth to surface without fully articulating them. He spoke about responsibility in abstract terms, about how wealth could distort intention, about how people often mistook success for character. He never named Victoria in these moments, yet her presence loomed over every word, an absence that felt heavier than accusation. When I asked him if there was anything he wanted me to tell her, he shook his head slowly, his expression resigned rather than angry, as if he had already accepted that some conversations arrived too late to matter. There were moments, however, when his silence cracked just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Late one evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, he admitted that he feared confrontation more than death itself. He said he had spent his life trying to keep peace between us, believing that time would soften, resentment and success would bring perspective. Instead, distance had hardened into entitlement, and affection had turned transactional. He confessed that he didn't know how to reach Victoria anymore without turning their relationship into a negotiation, and that realization haunted him far more than any illness ever could. In choosing silence, he had hoped to preserve what little connection remained, even if it meant carrying disappointment alone. After he passed, I found traces of that internal struggle everywhere. Notes scribbled in the margins of books, unfinished letters tucked into drawers, documents carefully organized but never explained. It became clear that my father had been preparing for something long before we understood its necessity, planning quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention to his intentions. His silence was not avoidance, but strategy, a way of ensuring that when truth finally emerged, it would stand on its own, unchallenged by emotional pressure or manipulation. He trusted the structure he put in place more than he trusted words spoken in moments of conflict. Understanding this changed how I viewed the courtroom battle unfolding before me. Victoria's accusations of manipulation and influence felt hollow against the memory of a man who had guarded his independence fiercely, who valued clarity and foresight above all else. He had been silent not because he was weak, but because he was patient, waiting for the right moment for truth to speak louder than he ever could. As the weight of that realization settled in, I understood that my father's silence was not a void to be filled, but a message unfolding in its own time, one that would soon surface in ways none of us could ignore. The moment the courtroom doors opened, the shift in the air was unmistakable, like a sudden change in pressure before a storm breaks. Conversations halted mid-sentence, papers stilled in trembling hands, and even the judge looked up with faint irritation at the interruption. I turned instinctively, unsure of what I expected to see, and that was when I noticed him. A tall man in a sharply tailored black suit, his movements calm and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. He didn't rush or apologize for being late, yet nothing about his presence felt careless. He carried a leather briefcase worn at the edges, the kind that suggested use rather than display, and his expression was composed, serious, and entirely unafraid of the attention now focused on him. Victoria's lawyers reacted first, whispering urgently among themselves, confusion flickering across their polished professionalism. Victoria herself frowned, her confidence momentarily disrupted, her gaze sharpening as she assessed this unexpected variable. I felt a knot tighten in my chest, uncertain whether this interruption would help or harm me, but something about the man's steady demeanor stirred a quiet sense of anticipation. When he reached the front of the courtroom, he paused, waiting for acknowledgement rather than demanding it, a subtle authority in his posture that contrasted sharply with the aggressive confidence Victoria had displayed all morning. The judge cleared his throat and asked the man to identify himself, his tone edged with impatience. The man responded evenly, introducing himself as Daniel Cross, legal trustee and personal attorney to Richard Hale. The sound of my father's name spoken aloud in that space sent a shock through me, sharp and immediate, as though the past had reached forward to grasp the present. Daniel explained that he had been legally bound to appear only upon the initiation of a dispute regarding the estate, and that his presence was neither accidental nor optional. As he spoke, he produced official documents, his movements precise, each paper placed before the court with a confidence that suggested meticulous preparation. Victoria's composure began to crack as Daniel continued, outlining his long-standing professional relationship with my father, one that spanned years and involved matters far beyond a simple will. He spoke of private consultations, carefully structured legal instruments, and safeguards designed to activate under specific circumstances. The language was technical, yet the implication was unmistakable. My father had anticipated conflict, and he had prepared for it thoroughly. I watched Victoria's expression shift from irritation to disbelief, her lips pressing into a thin line as the certainty she had relied upon began to erode. As Daniel described his role, fragments of memory surfaced for me, occasional mentions of a lawyer my father trusted, appointments he attended alone, phone calls he took behind closed doors. At the time, I had assumed these were routine matters, nothing worth questioning. Now, those moments aligned into a pattern, revealing a depth of foresight I had never fully appreciated. Daniel's presence was not a last-minute intervention, but the culmination of years of quiet planning, the physical embodiment of my father's resolve to let facts, not emotions, determine the outcome of his legacy. The courtroom atmosphere shifted from confrontation to uncertainty. Victoria's legal team attempted to object, their voices lacking the confidence they had carried earlier, but Daniel responded with calm precision, citing statutes and precedents that left little room for dismissal. He did not raise his voice or dramatize his statements. His power lay in restraint, in the certainty that what he carried could not be undone by bluster or intimidation. Each sentence tightened the focus of the room, drawing attention away from performance and toward substance. I sat frozen, my heart pounding, aware that something irreversible was unfolding. For the first time since the proceedings began, I felt my father's presence not as a memory, but as an active force, guiding events from beyond the grave through the mechanisms he had set in place. The man in the black suit stood as his proxy, calm and unyielding, and as the judge leaned forward to examine the documents now before him, it became clear that the narrative Victoria had constructed was beginning to unravel under the weight of truths she had never anticipated. The courtroom seemed to contract inward as Daniel Cross opened his briefcase, the soft click of its locks echoing louder than any gavel strike. From where I sat, every movement felt suspended in time, as though the room itself understood that whatever emerged next would alter the course of everything said before. Daniel removed a thick folder bound with a deep blue ribbon, its edges worn not from age but from careful handling, the kind reserved for documents that mattered too much to be rushed. He placed it on the table with deliberate calm and explained that what he was about to present was not a revision of my father's will, but a legally distinct instrument designed to operate alongside it, activated only under conditions my father had precisely defined. He referred to it as a conditional testament, though in essence it was a safeguard, a framework that transformed my father's intentions into enforceable reality. The primary will, which Victoria's legal team had relied upon so heavily, outlined general distributions and responsibilities. But this secondary document addressed contingencies my father believed were inevitable. Daniel spoke of clauses tied to conduct rather than entitlement, provisions that assessed behavior in the aftermath of his death rather than status achieved during his lifetime. The room grew quiet as he described how my father had insisted that legacy should reflect values demonstrated when no reward was guaranteed, not accomplishments achieved when applause was plentiful.